Elvis Presley sat in his mother's old bedroom at Graceland on November 3, 1972, holding a faded black and white photograph he'd just discovered tucked inside Gladys's Bible, a photograph that had been hidden there for over 30 years, pressed between the pages of the Book of Ruth like a pressed flower, its edges worn from being handled countless times before being secreted away. The photo showed his mother, impossibly young, maybe 17 or 18, standing next to a man Elvis had never seen before, and the way Gladys leaned into this stranger, the way her hand rested on his chest, the way she smiled with an openness Elvis had never witnessed in any other photograph, told him immediately that this wasn't just some casual friend or distant relative, but it was the inscription on the back, written in his mother's distinctive handwriting, that made Elvis's hands start shaking so violently he almost dropped the Bible entirely. James and me, summer 1933, the life I could have lived. That single sentence, those 9 words, would send Elvis spiraling into a months-long investigation of his mother's past, uncovering a secret romance, a choice that changed everything, and a question that would haunt him for the rest of his life. What if the woman who gave birth to him had chosen differently? What if he had never been born at all? What if his entire existence was built on his mother's sacrifice of her own happiness? Elvis had been avoiding his mother's room for the 14 years since her death in 1958. After the funeral, he'd ordered the door locked and the room preserved exactly as she'd left it. Occasionally, he'd go in there when the grief felt manageable, sit on her bed, smell the faint trace of her perfume that still clung to the pillows, and try to feel close to her again. But mostly, he stayed away. The pain was too acute, too overwhelming, too much like drowning. But today, November 3, 1972, marked what would have been Gladys's 60th birthday, and Elvis had woken up feeling like he needed to be near her somehow. So he'd unlocked the door, dismissed the security detail, and entered the time capsule of his mother's final days. Everything was exactly as she'd left it. The hairbrush on the dresser still held strands of her dark hair. The closet still contained her dresses, now hopelessly outdated but too precious to remove. The nightstand still held the book she'd been reading, a romance novel she'd never finished. And on that same nightstand sat her Bible, the one she'd read from every night, the one she'd quoted to Elvis throughout his childhood, the one that had traveled with her from Tupelo to Memphis to Graceland. Elvis picked up the Bible carefully, as if it might disintegrate in his hands. The leather binding was worn smooth from decades of handling. He opened it randomly, and a piece of paper fell out, a prayer card from Jesse Garon's funeral, the twin brother who died at birth. Elvis had seen this before. His mother kept it as a bookmark, a constant reminder of the son she'd lost. But then, as he flipped through the pages more carefully, something else caught his eye. Between the pages of the Book of Ruth, a story about loyalty, sacrifice, and choosing family over personal desire, there was a photograph he'd never seen before. He pulled it out carefully. The photo was old, the kind with slightly blurred edges and that distinctive grain of 1930s film stock. It showed a young woman who was unmistakably his mother, but a version of Gladys he'd never encountered. She couldn't have been more than 18, wearing a simple summer dress, her hair loose around her shoulders instead of the tight curls she'd worn for as long as Elvis could remember. She was beautiful in a way that seemed almost otherworldly, unguarded, joyful, radiant. Next to her stood a man in his early 20s, tall and lean, wearing work clothes and holding a guitar. He had his arm around Gladys's waist, and she had her hand on his chest, and they were looking at each other with an intensity that made Elvis's stomach clench. This wasn't the way his mother had ever looked at his father, Vernon. This was something else entirely, something raw and passionate and all-consuming. Elvis turned the photo over with hands that had started to shake. The inscription on the back was in his mother's handwriting, but younger, less controlled, more exuberant than the careful script he knew from his childhood. James and me, summer 1933, the life I could have lived. God forgive me, but some days I still dream about it. Some days I wonder what kind of person I would have been if I'd had the courage to choose love over duty. But then I remember, if I'd chosen differently, Elvis wouldn't exist, and even in my darkest moments, I can't imagine a world without my son. So I fold this dream away and choose the life I have. Choose Vernon, choose my boys, choose the hard road of responsibility over the easy path of passion. But I keep this photograph as a reminder that once, just once, I knew what it felt like to be completely, perfectly alive. G. May 1944. Elvis read the inscription 3 times, 4 times, 5 times. Each reading revealed new layers of heartbreak, new implications that made his world tilt sideways. Summer 1933. His mother would have been 17. She'd married Vernon Presley in June of 1933. So this photograph, this James, this romance, it had happened right before the marriage, maybe even during the courtship. Maybe his mother had been torn between 2 men and had chosen Vernon not out of love, but out of duty, out of practicality, out of some sense of obligation that Elvis couldn't fully understand. And the date on the inscription, May 1944, that was 6 months before he was born. His mother had written this note while she was pregnant with him and Jessie Garon, had looked at this photograph of another man and wondered about the life she could have lived, had actually written the words, "If I'd chosen differently, Elvis wouldn't exist." Elvis felt something twist violently in his chest. His entire existence was predicated on his mother's sacrifice. She'd given up the great love of her life, the man who made her smile like that, the life that could have been hers, and had chosen instead to marry Vernon Presley, a man she clearly didn't love with the same intensity, because it was the responsible choice, the dutiful choice, the choice that would eventually result in Elvis's birth. But at what cost? What had that sacrifice done to her? Had she spent her entire marriage mourning the life she'd given up? When she looked at Vernon, did she see this James guy? When she held Elvis as a baby, did she wonder what James's children would have looked like? Elvis stood up abruptly, the photograph clutched in his hand, and began pacing the small bedroom. Questions cascaded through his mind, each one more disturbing than the last. Who was James? Where had his mother met him? Why had she chosen Vernon instead? Had Vernon known about James? Had the choice been Gladys's alone, or had there been family pressure, social expectations, economic realities that forced her hand? And the biggest question, the one that made Elvis feel sick, if his mother had chosen James, would she have been happier? Would she have lived longer? Would she have died at 46 from a broken heart and alcohol, or would she have thrived in a different life, a life built on passion instead of duty? Elvis looked around the room, this shrine to a woman who'd sacrificed everything for him, and suddenly saw it differently, not just as evidence of loss, but as evidence of a life half-lived. His mother had kept this room comfortable but sparse, functional but not particularly joyful. There were no personal touches beyond the basics, no hobbies or interests reflected in the decor, nothing that suggested Gladys Presley had had any identity beyond Elvis's mother and Vernon's wife. Had she lost herself? Had choosing duty over love meant choosing to become invisible? Elvis left the bedroom and went to his father's room. Vernon was out, probably at one of his girlfriend's houses. He'd remarried after Gladys's death and then divorced, and now spent most of his time with various women, none of whom seemed to matter much to him. Elvis was suddenly furious at his father, though he couldn't quite articulate why. Vernon hadn't done anything wrong, technically. He'd married Gladys, worked hard, when he worked at all, fathered Elvis and Jessie Garon, but he'd never made Gladys smile like the man in that photograph. He'd never been the great love of her life. He'd just been there. Elvis found his father's old photo albums, the ones before Elvis was famous, before Graceland, before everything changed. He flipped through them looking for clues, for context, for anything that might help him understand. The photos of his parents' wedding day showed Gladys looking pretty but subdued, not radiant like in the picture with James. Photos from Elvis's childhood showed a tired woman who loved her son fiercely, but who always seemed to carry some invisible weight.
Even in the happiest family photos, there was something in Gladys's eyes, a distance, a wistfulness, a sense of being physically present but emotionally elsewhere. Had Elvis just never noticed? Or had he been too young, too self-absorbed, too focused on his own life and dreams to see that his mother was slowly disappearing into the role she'd chosen instead of the life she'd wanted? Over the next several weeks, Elvis became obsessed with finding out who James was. He started by calling his aunts and uncles, the older relatives who might remember his mother in her teenage years. His Aunt Lillian remembered James immediately. "Oh, honey, your mama was crazy about that boy," said his Aunt Lillian over the phone, her voice going soft with memory. James Monroe was his name, came through Tupelo in the summer of '33, working odd jobs, playing guitar at the church socials. He was a few years older than Gladys, maybe 21 or 22. Good-looking fellow, talented musician, had that wandering spirit, always talking about going to Memphis, to Nashville, to anywhere but Tupelo.
"What happened?" Elvis asked, his voice tight. "Well, your mama fell hard, harder than I'd ever seen anyone fall. She'd sneak out to meet him, stay out till all hours, listening to him play guitar and sing. She told me once that when she was with James, she felt like she could be anybody, do anything, like the whole world was open to her." "So why didn't she marry him?" Lillian sighed. "Because James was leaving, baby. He got an offer to join a traveling band, work his way up to Nashville. He asked Gladys to come with him, told her they could make it work, build a life together around music." "And she said no?" "She said no, because James couldn't promise her stability, couldn't promise her a home or regular meals or any of the things that mattered when you grew up poor like we did. And your grandma, Gladys's mama, she laid it out plain. You can follow your heart and probably end up broke and abandoned in some strange city, or you can marry Vernon Presley, who's got a job and wants to settle down and give you a decent life. So Gladys chose decent, chose safe, chose Vernon." "Did she love my daddy?" Elvis asked, needing to know. Lillian was quiet for a long moment. "She came to love him in her way. Vernon was good to her, mostly. But that first love, that James Monroe love, that was different. That was the kind of love that changes you, ruins you for anything else. Your mama spent her whole life comparing every moment to those few months with James, and everything else came up short." After talking to Lillian, Elvis called other relatives, old family friends, anyone who might have known his mother in her youth. Slowly, piece by piece, the story emerged. James Monroe had been a traveling musician working his way through Mississippi in the summer of 1933. He'd stopped in Tupelo for a few weeks, taken a job at the lumber mill, and played music at night. Gladys Presley, née Smith, had been 17, working at the Tupelo garment factory, living with her parents in a house so small that privacy was impossible. They'd met at a church social where James was performing. According to multiple accounts, Gladys had been transfixed by his guitar playing and singing. After the performance, she'd approached him, something very forward for a young woman in 1933, and they'd talked for hours. What followed was a brief, intense romance that everyone noticed and everyone whispered about. Gladys and James were inseparable for 6 weeks. He taught her guitar chords, she sang harmony while he played. They talked about music and dreams and all the places they'd go together. James had plans to leave Tupelo by August, join a band in Memphis, work his way to Nashville. He wanted Gladys to come with him, would have married her, according to those who knew him. But marriage to James meant uncertainty, meant leaving everything familiar, meant trusting that love would be enough to sustain them through the hard times. Gladys's family had been horrified at the prospect. Her mother had forbidden it, told Gladys that following James would ruin her life, that she'd end up abandoned and broke in some strange city while James chased his impossible dreams. Vernon Presley, meanwhile, had been courting Gladys too. He wasn't exciting like James, but he was local, he was known, he was safe. Vernon had a job driving a truck, modest but steady income. He wanted to marry Gladys, settle down, start a family. He represented security in a world that offered precious little of it. The choice, everyone said, had torn Gladys apart. She loved James with a passion that scared her, but she was practical enough to understand that passion doesn't pay bills or put food on the table. So on June 17, 1933, Gladys Smith married Vernon Presley in a quick ceremony at the county courthouse. James Monroe left Tupelo 2 days later without saying goodbye, and Gladys never saw him again. But she kept the photograph, kept it hidden in her Bible, in the book of Ruth, the story of a woman who chose loyalty and duty over her own desires. And she wrote that note 11 years later while pregnant with Elvis, acknowledging what she'd given up and why. Elvis learned all of this over the course of several weeks, and each new piece of information felt like a stone added to a weight he was carrying in his chest. His mother had sacrificed her chance at happiness for security, and that security gave him Elvis, but it also gave her a life of quiet desperation, always wondering what could have been.